The anniversary dinner is cancelled, Mom. Something came up, Daniel said, his voice calm, almost too calm, before hanging up like it was nothing more than rescheduling a dentist appointment, and Margaret Whitmore stood in her quiet kitchen holding her phone, staring at her reflection in the darkened window as the words echoed in a way that didn't quite settle right in her chest, because Daniel had never missed an anniversary dinner, not in the 12 years since his father passed, not even the year he had the flu and showed up anyway. Pale and shivering but smiling for her sake, and yet tonight, there was no hesitation in his tone, no apology, no suggestion of another day, just a clean, simple cancellation that felt rehearsed, like a line he had practiced before dialing her number, and Margaret slowly set the phone down on the counter, her fingers lingering for a moment as if expecting it to ring again with an explanation that would make everything feel normal, but it didn't, and the house around her remained still, filled only with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the stove, and she turned slightly, her eyes falling on the small details she had prepared throughout the afternoon, the navy blue dress hanging neatly on the back of the chair, the gift box wrapped with careful precision, the faint scent of cinnamon from the pie cooling by the window, all quiet witnesses to a night that was supposed to be shared, and she told herself it was fine, that things happened, that people got busy, that this was what life looked like when children grew older and built families of their own, and yet something in her chest tightened, not sharp enough to be pain, but steady enough to be noticed, like a whisper she couldn't quite ignore, and she moved slowly to the sink, rinsing her hands out of habit more than necessity, trying to settle the unease with routine, but it lingered quiet and persistent, and later that evening, when the house had grown darker and the tea in her cup had gone lukewarm, she reached for her phone again, not to call Daniel, but simply to distract herself, scrolling absent-mindedly through familiar updates and photos, until her thumb paused mid-motion, her breath catching in a way she didn't expect, because there, on Olivia's page, was a photo posted just 20 minutes earlier, a long dining table glowing under soft candlelight, crystal glasses raised in a toast, flowers arranged with care, and Olivia standing at the center in a silk dress, smiling in that polished, effortless way Margaret had always admired from a distance, and in the caption, written in neat, cheerful words, were the words "Family is everything," followed by a small red heart, and Margaret stared at the image, her eyes moving slowly from one detail to the next, counting the place settings, recognizing the familiar dining room in Daniel's house, noting the presence of guests she had seen at previous gatherings, and most of all, noticing the one thing that wasn't there, the one person who had always been there, the one seat that had always been set without question, and she realized, with a clarity that settled cold and steady rather than loud or dramatic, that the dinner had not been cancelled at all. It had happened exactly as planned, just without her, and for a long moment Margaret didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react the way someone might expect, because there was no immediate anger, no sudden tears, only a quiet stillness as the truth unfolded piece by piece in her mind, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the calm expression reflected faintly on her screen, something shifted, not breaking, not collapsing but adjusting, like a door she hadn't realized was closed slowly opening to reveal a room she had never been meant to see. Margaret did not sleep well that night, not because she was restless or anxious in any obvious way, but because her mind kept returning to the same quiet image, the candlelit table, the raised glasses, the caption that declared something she had always believed without question, and now, for the first time, she wondered if that belief had been hers alone, and by morning, the house felt different, not unfamiliar, but slightly shifted, as though the walls themselves had absorbed what she had seen, and were now holding it in silence, and she moved through her routine with the same steady pace she had carried for years, making her coffee, placing a slice of the untouched pie onto a small plate, sitting at the kitchen table where the sunlight stretched across the wood in long, pale lines, and she told herself again that there must be an explanation, something simple, something that would restore the balance she had always trusted, but even as the thought formed, it did not settle the way it used to, and instead it lingered at the edge of her mind, incomplete, and she realized that what unsettled her was not just the dinner itself, but how easily it had been removed from her without resistance, without discussion, without even the courtesy of hesitation. And as she took a slow sip of her coffee, she began to notice the pattern that had once felt like coincidence, the small moments that had never seemed important enough to question, Daniel canceling visits at the last minute, Olivia sending brief messages instead of calling, holidays that became smaller, quieter, sometimes moved, sometimes forgotten entirely, and each time Margaret had adjusted, had smiled, had said it was fine, because she believed that families changed, that life moved forward, that love did not need constant presence to remain real. But now, sitting there in the quiet of her kitchen, she allowed herself to revisit those moments without the soft explanation she had always given them, and one by one, they arranged themselves differently, not as isolated events, but as something more deliberate, more consistent. And she thought about the last Christmas when she had been told the gathering would be simple, just immediate family, and yet later saw photographs of a full house, neighbors and friends gathered together, laughter captured in bright images that never included her. And she remembered the afternoon she had driven across town to attend her grandson's school event, only to be told at the door that it had already happened earlier that morning, and how Olivia had apologized with a gentle smile that now, in hindsight, felt carefully measured rather than sincere. And Margaret set her cup down slowly, her fingers resting against the ceramic as if grounding herself in the present moment, because the realization was not loud or overwhelming, it was quiet, methodical, almost calm, and that was what made it more difficult to dismiss. And she stood, walking to the living room where framed photographs lined the shelves, years of birthdays, holidays, small gatherings that had once felt like proof of something unshakable, and she studied them with new attention, noticing who stood where, who leaned closer, who seemed slightly apart. And for the first time, she saw how often Olivia occupied the center, how naturally the others arranged themselves around her, how Daniel's posture had subtly shifted over the years, turning toward his wife rather than toward his mother. And Margaret did not feel anger as much as she felt clarity, a slow, steady understanding that something had been changing long before she had allowed herself to see it, and that the dinner had not been an isolated decision, but part of a pattern that had been unfolding quietly, patiently, over time. And as she reached up to straighten one of the frames, her reflection caught faintly in the glass. She paused, studying the woman looking back at her, composed, calm, and more aware than she had been just a day before. And in that still moment, Margaret Whitmore understood that whatever came next would not be met with the same unquestioning acceptance she had offered in the past. Margaret did not rush to confront anyone, and that was what made the shift inside her so precise, so deliberate, because instead of reacting, she began to observe. And that afternoon, when her phone rang and Daniel's name appeared on the screen, she let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if she were listening not just to his voice, but to everything beneath it. And when she finally spoke, her tone was the same as it had always been, calm, warm, unchanged. And Daniel filled the silence quickly, explaining that he felt bad about the canceled dinner, that work had been overwhelming, that they would make it up to her soon. And Margaret listened without interrupting, without correcting him, without mentioning the photograph she had seen just hours earlier, because she wanted to hear how far he would go without being prompted. And as he spoke, she noticed the details, the way his sentences came too smoothly, the lack of pauses where there should have been thought, the absence of specifics that might have made the story feel real. And when he finished, she simply said that she understood that these things happened. And there was a brief moment on the line, a hesitation so slight it might have gone unnoticed before, but now it stood out clearly, like a misplaced note in an otherwise familiar melody. And after they hung up, Margaret remained still, holding the phone in her hand, not because she needed confirmation anymore, but because she was allowing herself to fully accept what she already knew. And later that evening, she found herself returning to the photographs, not with shock this time, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, studying them more carefully, noticing the arrangement of the table, the number of guests, the expressions on their faces. And she recognized several of them, friends of Daniel, neighbors, even a distant relative who had not attended previous gatherings. And it became clear that this had not been a last-minute dinner. It had been planned, prepared, executed with intention. And Margaret's absence had not been an oversight. It had been a decision. And as that realization settled, she began to consider something she had never allowed herself to fully question before, not just what had happened, but who had guided it. Because while Daniel had delivered the words, it was Olivia who had shaped the environment, Olivia who controlled the invitations, the arrangements, the subtle shifts in family routines. And Margaret thought back to the early years, when Olivia had first joined the family, polite, attentive, always quick to offer help, always careful with her words, and how gradually, almost imperceptibly, she had begun to influence the structure of gatherings, suggesting changes, introducing new traditions, gently redirecting plans in ways that seemed reasonable at the time. And Margaret had accepted it all. with grace, believing it was part of welcoming someone new into the family. But now, looking at the pattern as a whole, she saw something different, something far more intentional, and she walked slowly to the dining table, the same one where she had expected to sit the night before, running her hand lightly across its surface as if measuring the space that had been denied to her elsewhere, and she imagined the conversation that must have taken place, the decisions made without her, the ease with which her presence had been removed, and yet, instead of feeling diminished, Margaret felt something else take its place, something steadier, more grounded, because for the first time, she was no longer filling in the gaps with assumptions of goodwill. She was seeing the situation as it was, without softening it, without excusing it, and that clarity brought with it a quiet strength, and as she turned off the lights that evening, leaving the house in darkness, Margaret Whitmore understood that she was no longer waiting to be included. She was beginning to decide how she would respond. The next morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm as any other, but Margaret moved through it differently, not slower, not faster, just more aware, as if each small action now carried weight that had once gone unnoticed, and as she stood by the window watching the early sunlight stretch across her front yard, she found herself thinking not about what had happened, but about how long it had been happening without her truly seeing it, and the thought did not come with regret so much as recognition, because she had always chosen to believe in the best version of her family, had always smoothed over the moments that did not quite fit, and now those moments returned with a clarity that felt almost precise, like pieces of a puzzle finally aligning into something undeniable. And she remembered a dinner from 2 years ago when Olivia had suggested moving the gathering to a restaurant at the last minute, explaining that it would be easier for everyone, and Margaret had agreed. Without hesitation, only to find herself seated at the far end of the table, conversations flowing around her but rarely including her. Daniel's attention pulled consistently toward his wife, and she had dismissed the feeling then, telling herself she was imagining things, that it was natural for dynamics to shift. But now, standing in her kitchen with her hands resting lightly against the counter, she allowed herself to revisit that evening without the softening lens she had always applied. And it looked different, sharper, more deliberate, and another memory surfaced, this one quieter, almost insignificant at the time, when Olivia had begun organizing family events through group messages that Margaret was often added to late, after details had already been decided, after locations and times were set, leaving her with little room to contribute, and each time, Olivia would respond with polite reassurance, saying she thought Margaret would prefer not to worry about the planning, that it was easier this way, and Margaret had accepted that explanation with a small smile, believing it was consideration rather than control. But now, the pattern revealed itself with a quiet certainty, and she walked into the living room, her gaze drifting once more to the photographs that lined the shelves, noticing how often she appeared slightly removed, positioned just outside the center of the frame, present but not essential, included but not prioritized, and the realization did not sting the way it might have days ago, because it was no longer a question of whether it was happening, but an understanding of how it had been constructed over time, carefully, patiently, without confrontation. And that was what struck Margaret most, not the absence itself, but the ease with which it had been created, how natural it must have felt to those involved, how unquestioned, and she considered Daniel again, her son, the boy she had raised with steady hands and quiet devotion, and she did not rush to blame him entirely, because she could see now how influence worked, how proximity and repetition shaped perception, how someone could gradually accept a version of reality presented to them often enough, and yet, even with that understanding, she did not excuse it, because there had been moments, small opportunities where he could have chosen differently, where he could have asked questions, where he could have noticed what she was beginning to see now, and he had not, and that absence of awareness was its own kind of decision. And Margaret exhaled slowly, not with frustration, but with a kind of calm acceptance, because clarity did not demand immediate action, it required patience, and she had always been patient, perhaps too much so, but now that patience carried a different purpose. And as she reached for her purse and prepared to step outside for the first time since the night before, she felt something settle firmly within her, not anger, not sadness, but a quiet resolve, the understanding that she no longer needed to interpret their actions through hope, that she could see them as they were and respond accordingly. And as she closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing briefly in the stillness of the house, Margaret Whitmore stepped into the morning with a clarity she had never allowed herself before, aware that what had once been hidden in plain sight was now fully visible, and that visibility had changed everything. Margaret did not go far that morning. Just a short walk down the familiar street where every house held years of quiet routine. But even in that small distance, something unexpected happened, because as she passed by Mrs. Collins's yard, the older woman looked up from her gardening and waved her over with an expression that carried more curiosity than usual, and Margaret hesitated for a brief moment before stepping closer, maintaining the same composed posture she had carried all week, and they exchanged the kind of polite greetings that had always filled their interactions, comments about the weather, the early bloom of spring flowers, the steady rhythm of neighborhood life. But then Mrs. Collins tilted her head slightly and said something that landed with a quiet precision, mentioning how lively Daniel's house had been the other night, how there had been cars lining the street, laughter carrying into the evening air, and Margaret felt the words settle into place without resistance, not as a shock, but as confirmation, because this time the information did not come from a screen or a memory. It came from someone who had no reason to shape it, no reason to soften it, and she nodded gently, offering a small smile, as if she had already known, as if the detail did not change anything, and Mrs. Collins continued, describing the decorations she had glimpsed through the windows, the soft glow of lights, the sense of celebration that had been impossible to miss, and Margaret listened with careful attention, not asking questions, not interrupting, simply allowing the picture to form fully, clearly, without distortion, and when the conversation ended, she thanked her neighbor with the same quiet grace she always had, turning back toward her house with a steady pace, her expression unchanged to anyone who might have seen her, but inside, the final layer of uncertainty had dissolved completely, leaving behind something far more solid than suspicion, and as she stepped through her front door, the familiar space welcomed her in the same way it always had, but she moved through it now with a different awareness, noticing not just what was present, but what had been absent from her life beyond these walls, and she placed her purse on the table with deliberate care, pausing for a moment as if marking the transition from what she had believed to what she now understood, and she walked slowly into the living room, where the silence felt less heavy than it had before, not because it had changed, but because she no longer filled it with questions that needed answers, and she sat down, folding her hands in her lap, allowing the quiet to settle around her without discomfort, because there was no longer anything to resolve in her mind, no loose thread to follow. The pattern was complete, and for the first time since that evening, she considered not what had been done to her, but what she would do next, and the thought did not come with urgency or impulse, it arrived slowly, carefully, shaped by the same patience that had defined her life for decades, but now directed with intention rather than habit, and she rose again after a few minutes, walking toward the hallway where a small desk stood against the wall, the place where she kept documents, letters, records of a life built over many years, and she opened the drawer with steady hands, not searching frantically but deliberately, as if she had already decided what she needed to see, and inside were neatly organized folders, each labeled with the same quiet precision she had always applied to everything she cared about, and she selected one, placing it gently on the desk, her fingers resting on the cover for a brief moment before opening it, and as she began to review its contents, her expression remained calm, unchanged, but there was something new in the way she moved, a quiet firmness, a sense that her actions were no longer guided by assumption, but by clarity, and as the afternoon light shifted across the room, casting longer shadows along the walls, Margaret Whitmore continued her work in silence, no longer waiting to be included in decisions made elsewhere, but beginning with careful intention to shape decisions of her own. Margaret did not rush through the documents, and that restraint became the quiet foundation of everything that followed, because each page she turned was not just information, it was confirmation of a life she had built with care, decisions made with intention, assets accumulated over decades of steady discipline, and as she reviewed account statements, property records, and legal papers, she was not searching for something new. She was reminding herself of what had always been hers to decide. And the realization did not come with pride or attachment, but with a clear understanding of responsibility, and for the first time in a long while, she considered how those decisions had been assumed by others without her consent, how easily her presence had been reduced in family matters while her contributions remained quietly expected, and she paused, resting her hand on one of the folders as the thought settled fully into place, because it was not just about being excluded from a dinner, it was about a pattern of inclusion when it benefited others and absence when it did not, and that pattern had extended into areas far beyond social gatherings, touching on trust, expectation, and the unspoken belief that she would always remain in the background, steady and predictable, and Margaret closed the folder gently, not with hesitation but with finality, as if acknowledging that she had seen enough to understand what needed to be done next, and she stood, walking toward the window where the late afternoon light filtered through the curtains in soft, even lines, and for a moment she simply stood there, not reflecting on the past, but considering the shape of what came next. And the decision did not arrive as a sudden impulse. It formed gradually, built from the same quiet clarity that had guided her thoughts since that evening, and she reached for her phone, dialing a number she had not needed to call in several years, her movements calm, deliberate, and when the line connected, her voice carried the same steady tone she had always used, polite, composed, but this time there was something more beneath it, something firmer, as she requested an appointment, not urgently, not emotionally, but with purpose. And after the call ended, she placed the phone back on the table, her expression unchanged, yet her posture subtly different, more grounded, more certain, and as the hours passed, she returned the documents to their place with careful precision, ensuring everything remained organized, because this was not about disruption, it was about control, about understanding exactly what she had and how it would be handled moving forward, and she moved through the rest of the evening with the same quiet routine, preparing a simple dinner, washing the dishes, turning off the lights one by one, but beneath that routine, there was a shift that could not be seen from the outside, a recalibration of where she stood in her own life, and later, as she sat in the living room with a small lamp casting a warm circle of light around her, she allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, not to dwell on what had happened, but to acknowledge what she had chosen, because this was no longer about reacting to exclusion, it was about redefining the terms of her presence entirely, and for the first time since she had seen those photographs, Margaret Whitmore felt not the absence of something taken from her, but the quiet return of something she had nearly forgotten, the certainty that she did not need to be invited to hold value, and that whatever came next would not be shaped by the expectations of others, but by her own clear and deliberate decisions. Margaret arrived 10 minutes early to the appointment, not because she was anxious, but because she had always believed that being prepared was a form of respect, and she sat in the quiet waiting room with her hands folded neatly in her lap, observing the soft hum of the overhead lights, the muted turning of pages from a magazine someone else had left behind, and when her name was called, she rose with the same composed posture she carried everywhere, stepping into the office with a calm that did not need to announce itself. And as she sat across from the attorney, a man who had once handled matters for her late husband, she did not begin with emotion or explanation. She simply stated that she wanted to review and update her documents, her voice steady, precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and the attorney nodded, accustomed to these kinds of requests, but there was a subtle shift in his expression as he realized this was not routine, that there was intention behind her words, and Margaret answered his questions with clarity, outlining what she wanted changed, what she wanted secured, what she wanted ensured for the future, and she did not mention Daniel or Olivia by name at first, because this was not about reacting to them, it was about defining her own position, and as the conversation continued, she gradually allowed their presence to enter the discussion, not as accusations, but as considerations, as variables that needed to be addressed with care, and the attorney listened closely, making notes, occasionally asking for clarification, and Margaret provided it without hesitation, because every decision she spoke of had already been considered long before she walked into that room. And when the meeting ended, she did not feel relief or satisfaction in any obvious way, only a quiet sense that something had been set in motion, something that would unfold in its own time, and she stepped back into the afternoon light with the same calm expression, her pace steady as she walked to her car, and on the drive home, she did not turn on the radio, she did not fill the silence with distraction, she simply allowed her thoughts to settle into place, each one aligning with the next in a way that felt orderly, intentional. And when she arrived home, she carried on with her routine as if nothing had changed, because from the outside, nothing had. The house remained quiet, the furniture unchanged, the photographs still resting in their frames, but beneath that stillness, a shift had already begun, and later that evening, her phone lit up with a message from Daniel, a simple invitation to dinner later that week, framed casually, as if it were an afterthought, as if the previous absence had already been forgotten, and Margaret read the message. Once, then again, her expression neutral, her mind clear, and she did not respond immediately, not out of uncertainty but out of choice, because timing, she understood now, mattered, and she set the phone down beside her, letting the message sit unanswered as she continued with her evening, preparing a light meal, rinsing her dishes, moving through each task with deliberate care, and only later, when the house had grown quiet again, did she pick up the phone and type a response, her words polite, measured, accepting the invitation without question, without reference to what had happened before. And when she sent the message, she did not feel the need to add anything more, because she understood something now that she had not fully understood before, that silence, when chosen intentionally, could carry more weight than any explanation. And as she turned off the lights and made her way upstairs, Margaret Whitmore carried with her not the burden of what had been done, but the quiet certainty of what she had already begun to do in return. The evening of the dinner arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to observe what would unfold, and Margaret prepared without haste, selecting her clothes with the same careful attention she had always given to family gatherings, but this time there was no anticipation, no soft hope beneath her actions, only a calm awareness of purpose, and as she fastened the clasp of her necklace and smoothed the fabric of her dress, she studied her reflection for a moment, not searching for reassurance, but acknowledging the quiet strength that had settled into her posture. And when she stepped out of the house, locking the door behind her, she did not look back, because there was nothing inside that needed confirmation anymore. And the drive to Daniel's house was familiar, every turn and stoplight part of a routine she had followed countless times before. Yet tonight it felt different, not because the road had changed, but because she had, and when she arrived, the house stood just as it always had, warm lights glowing through the windows, the faint sound of conversation drifting into the night air, and she paused briefly before stepping forward, not out of hesitation but to observe, to take in the details she might have overlooked before, and then she walked to the door and knocked, her movements steady, unhurried, and when Olivia opened it, her expression shifted for just a fraction of a second, surprise flickering before settling into the familiar polished smile, and she greeted Margaret with warmth that felt practiced, her tone light, her words welcoming, and Margaret returned the greeting with equal calm, stepping inside without comment, allowing herself to be guided into the living room where Daniel stood, his expression brightening as he saw her, though there was a trace of something else beneath it, something that might have been relief or perhaps uncertainty. And as the evening unfolded, Margaret observed more than she spoke, noting the arrangement of the table, the way conversations formed and dissolved, the subtle dynamics that moved through the room, and she noticed how easily Olivia directed the flow of interaction, how naturally others responded to her cues, and how Daniel followed without question. And yet, this time Margaret did not position herself at the edges, she did not wait to be included, she entered conversations when she chose, spoke when she had something to say, and allowed silence when she did not, and the shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it changed the rhythm of the evening in ways that could be felt even if they were not acknowledged. And at dinner, as glasses were raised and light laughter filled the room, Margaret listened carefully, not just to the words being spoken, but to what was left unsaid, and when a moment of pause settled naturally over the table, she spoke with a calm clarity that drew quiet attention, mentioning that she had recently reviewed some important matters, that she had taken steps to ensure everything was properly arranged for the future, and her tone remained even, almost casual, yet the words carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere slightly, and Daniel looked at her with a brief flicker of confusion, while Olivia's smile held steady, though her eyes sharpened with interest, and Margaret did not elaborate, did not explain further, she simply allowed the statement to exist, letting it settle into the space between them, and the conversation moved on, but something had changed, something that could not be undone by returning to lighter topics, and as the evening continued, Margaret maintained the same composed presence, neither confrontational nor withdrawn, simply present in a way that required acknowledgement, and when the dinner came to an end she stood, thanking them with the same quiet politeness she had always shown, but this time as she looked at Daniel and Olivia, there was no trace of uncertainty in her gaze, only a steady understanding that they had not yet fully grasped, and as she stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze brushing lightly against her face, Margaret Whitmore knew that the balance had shifted, not through conflict or accusation, but through something far more enduring, the quiet assertion of her own place in a story that would no longer be written without her. Margaret did not speak about that evening again, not to Daniel, not to Olivia, and not even to herself in the quiet hours that followed, because she understood that what had taken place did not need repetition to remain real, it only needed time to unfold, and over the next few days she moved through her life with the same steady rhythm. Yet beneath that calm exterior, everything had already shifted into place, and when the call came from her attorney confirming that the updates had been completed, that every document now reflected her intentions clearly and without ambiguity, she listened carefully, asked the necessary questions, and thanked him with the same composed tone she had always used. But when the call ended, she allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge that something irreversible had been set, something that would not be undone by conversation or apology. And later that week, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly, his expression carrying a mixture of curiosity and unease that he did not attempt to hide completely, and Margaret welcomed him inside with quiet politeness, offering him a seat at the kitchen table where sunlight filtered in through the window, just as it had every morning, and for a few moments they spoke about ordinary things, the weather, his work, small details that filled the space without meaning, until finally, he hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface of the table as he asked about the comment she had made during dinner, about reviewing important matters, and Margaret looked at him steadily, her expression calm, her posture relaxed, and she answered without hesitation, explaining that she had taken the time to organize her affairs, to ensure that everything was arranged in a way that reflected her decisions, her priorities, her understanding of what mattered, and Daniel listened, nodding slowly, though the uncertainty in his expression did not fade, and he asked if everything was all right, if there was something he should know, and Margaret held his gaze for a moment before responding, not with accusation, not with emotion, but with clarity, telling him that everything was exactly as it should be, that she simply believed in making decisions while she was fully able to do so, rather than leaving them to be assumed by others, and the words settled between them with a weight that did not need to be emphasized, and Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, as if adjusting to a space that felt unfamiliar, and for the first time there was a quiet awareness in his eyes, a recognition that something had changed in a way he did not fully understand, and Margaret did not attempt to explain it further because she knew that understanding would come in its own time, shaped not by what she said, but by what had already been done. And when Daniel left that afternoon, thanking her in a voice that carried more thought than before, Margaret walked him to the door with the same gentle composure, watching as he stepped out into the daylight, and as she closed the door behind him, the soft click echoed through the house with a finality that felt neither heavy nor light, simply certain, and she turned back into the quiet space that had always been hers, moving through it with a calm that no longer carried doubt, because she understood now that inclusion given by others could be taken away just as easily, but the authority she held over her own life could not. And as the days passed, Margaret Whitmore did not wait for invitations, did not look for acknowledgement, because she no longer needed either. She had already stepped into a position that did not depend on their choices, and whether they realized it immediately or not, the truth remained unchanged. They had once decided she did not belong at the table, and now, without a single raised voice or harsh word, she had quietly decided who would remain at hers.